Two elderly men found shot execution style in a quiet Michigan home. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just clean, deliberate killings. The killer? A convicted sex offender with a lifetime of violence, who claimed it was all self-defense. But nothing at that crime scene made sense. What really happened inside the house on Fishville Road, and how did no one stop him sooner? The house on Fishville Road, nestled in the quiet landscape of Grass Lake Township, stood motionless under the gray morning sky. The sun had barely pierced through the trees when law enforcement arrived, but the silence inside had already been broken hours earlier by something far louder than words, the sound of gunfire and the collapse of bodies. Inside the modest one-story home, officers discovered a scene so disturbing it would leave an imprint long after the blood had dried. Near the fireplace, lying face down on a once beige carpet now soaked in a dark, coagulated pool, was the body of Delmer Friley. He was 80 years old. His hands, frail and thin, showed no signs of struggle. A single gunshot wound at the back of his head suggested he never saw it coming. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, just the cold precision of a bullet and a man who didn't have time to ask why. Behind the house, slumped across the back steps leading to the driveway, lay Michael Pauley, 70 years old. Unlike Delmer, his death seemed more chaotic. His body was twisted mid-motion, a frozen snapshot of attempted escape. A bloodied phone rested near his hand, its screen cracked but still glowing. He had been shot in the face, possibly after turning back to confront his killer, possibly while trying to plead. The damage was devastating. The expression on what remained of his face was unreadable. No signs of forced entry, no valuables missing, no evidence of a break-in gone wrong. What investigators found instead was a crime scene suggesting something far more sinister. An execution, not an accident. There were no defensive wounds, no foreign DNA under fingernails, just clean shots, purposeful placement, and the overwhelming presence of violence with intent. The killer didn't run. He didn't panic. He took the keys to Michael Pauley's truck and drove away, slowly, deliberately, as if finishing a chore. His name was Zachary Borton. What was most disturbing wasn't what he had done, but how easily he had done it. Zachary wasn't a stranger to the law. His criminal record traced back decades, a string of thefts, armed robberies, sexual misconduct, and prison affiliations that painted a clear psychological profile. High-risk behavior, low empathy, and a recurring belief that control could be taken by force. What unfolded inside that home wasn't spontaneous rage. It wasn't an emotional break or a chaotic accident. It was escalation. Years of aggression and manipulation culminating in the moment where Zachary crossed the line into calculated, irreversible violence. Zachary had spent most of his life on the margins, not because he was pushed there, but because he chose to operate in spaces where rules were suggestions and people were pawns. His past convictions were not isolated events, but chapters in a long narrative of criminal development. From his earliest offenses in his teens, Zachary demonstrated a need for dominance. He stole not just for gain, but to challenge systems. He threatened not only to intimidate, but to establish psychological leverage. And when he assaulted, he made sure his victims were powerless. This wasn't simply a man who snapped. The crime scene in Grass Lake was not the outburst of a cornered man. It was the surgical removal of obstacles. And in Zachary's mind, those two men, Delmer and Michael, had become just that, disposable, inconvenient in the way. In forensic psychology, this behavioral pattern is often seen in offenders who develop what is known as instrumental aggression. The violence is not driven by emotion. It is purposeful, controlled. The goal is to eliminate, not to express. That's why Delmare was shot cleanly, quietly. That's why Michael was taken out in a moment of retreat. At some point during the night, Zachary made a decision. Whether it was days in the making or made in the quiet minutes before dawn, it was a choice that would define the rest of his life and end 2 others without warning. And when the morning light finally touched the home's front porch, it revealed not just blood, but something colder, intention. From this moment on, it was no longer a mystery of who. It became a question of why, and how many others had been at risk before that final trigger was pulled. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. Long before the house on Fishville Road became a crime scene, Zachary Borton had already laid the foundation for a life defined by control, defiance, and destruction. His record didn't begin with murder. It began with trespassing, then theft, then armed robbery. Every new offense a shade darker than the last, each a calculated step deeper into lawlessness. By the time he was 18, he had already crossed a boundary that many never return from. Convicted of third-degree criminal sexual conduct with a minor between the ages of 13 and 15. The charge marked him for life. He became a registered sex offender before he had even reached legal adulthood. Zachary didn't fade into obscurity after that. He moved from county to county, Hillsdale, Jackson Branch, never staying in one place long enough to form roots, yet always present enough to leave behind fear and damage. Car theft, fraud, unarmed robbery. His crimes weren't impulsive. They were adaptive. He adjusted to circumstances like a predator altering its hunt, always one step ahead of law enforcement until he wasn't. He spent years behind bars, but prison didn't reform him. It refined him. Inside, he joined ranks with known gang members, forming alliances that served as both protection and power. He learned when to stay quiet, when to posture, and when to strike. Violence became less of a reaction and more of a language, a tool used to navigate both prison politics and personal grievances. Psychologically, Zachary fit the profile of someone operating under antisocial personality disorder. He was manipulative, lacking remorse, and had no regard for social norms. He saw people as variables, things to manage, not connect with. When relationships didn't benefit him, he discarded them. When they became obstacles, he removed them. Despite this, there were moments when Zachary attempted to present a different version of himself, a father, a husband, even a man who once served in the military. But these identities were often weapons in disguise, crafted narratives used to exploit sympathy or buy time when the walls began to close in. His relationship with his wife had collapsed long before the murders. There were restraining orders, custody battles, and accusations of domestic violence. He had, on more than one occasion, attempted to take their son by force. In one instance, he followed her to a park, used his vehicle to block her in, and tried to remove the child from her car. Witnesses reported him ramming the vehicle, escalating the encounter to near disaster before fleeing the scene. In another event, Zachary attempted to break into her home. Failing to force the door open, he pulled out a firearm and shot through the glass, not in an attempt to hurt her directly, but to destroy the surveillance camera pointed at him. A message, perhaps, or maybe just another attempt to erase evidence he couldn't control. Each of these incidents was documented. Each showed an increasing willingness to use violence as his first and only solution. And yet, somehow, the system failed to intervene in a way that stopped him completely. Instead, it waited until 2 men were dead. By the time Zachary arrived at the home on Fishville Road, he had already become someone capable of detachment so complete, it made him dangerous in a way few truly are. This wasn't a man who killed out of panic. This was someone who had rehearsed control in so many forms that killing, when it happened, felt less like a breakdown and more like a choice. He didn't run immediately after the murders. He didn't try to cover his tracks with chaos. He drove calmly to Grand Rapids, contacted his wife, and spoke in riddles. He told her he had done something bad, that he didn't know what would happen next. But he didn't confess. Not yet. That would come later, in a room filled with silence, under the scrutiny of trained detectives who knew exactly what they were dealing with. A man who had been building to this moment for decades, in full view of a society that never looked quite close enough. When Zachary Borton was finally brought into custody, there was no resistance, no chase, no dramatic takedown. Just quiet compliance, as though he had known all along that this day would come. But even in handcuffs, he wasn't powerless. He entered the interrogation room not as a broken man, but as someone calculating his next move. The room was bare, clinical. A metal table, 2 chairs, a camera watching from above, and a man who had already played this game more times than most detectives would care to admit. He didn't confess immediately. He negotiated. He made demands. One request repeated itself more than once. He wanted to see his wife. Not to apologize, not to explain, but to say goodbye. It was unclear whether this was a final grasp at human connection or another attempt to manipulate the terms of his reality. Still, the detectives agreed, and in that brief reunion, when he held his young son for the last time, something shifted. The mask of control cracked just slightly. When they returned to the room, Zachary's posture had changed. He sat back in his chair differently, less guarded, more aware. He understood now that everything ahead of him was fixed. The charges, the weight of evidence, the inevitable loss of freedom. What he still had left was the story. His version of it. He began to talk. Slowly, at first, testing the water. Then, with more clarity. He described the night of the murders in fragments, not always in sequence, sometimes drifting into vagueness when the details became too sharp. He claimed Michael Pauly had been behaving erratically, that he was high, that he kept entering the room where Zachary was staying, waving a gun and accusing him of hiding someone. Zachary said he felt threatened, that he warned Michael, that eventually, when the gun was pointed his way, he fired. Once, maybe twice. He couldn't remember exactly. But the story didn't stop there. According to Zachary, after the first shooting, he heard more gunshots downstairs. He said he ran, confused and scared, toward the source. There, he encountered Delmare. There was a confrontation. Something in Delmare's hands, a weapon, he thought. In the blur of adrenaline, Zachary fired again. The explanation was classic self-defense. Fear, reaction, survival. But it didn't fit. There were no weapons found near the victims. No sign that either man had made a move to attack. Delmare, especially, appeared to have been caught entirely off guard. The placement of the gunshot, the lack of defensive injuries, the calm scene surrounding his body, it all pointed to one conclusion. He had been executed, not engaged in a struggle. Zachary didn't offer answers for the inconsistencies. When confronted with them, he shifted, retreated into vague language, or simply nodded without elaboration. It became clear that the details weren't as important to him as the narrative itself. He wanted to be seen as someone who had no choice, a man forced into violence. But the forensics didn't support that claim, nor did the behavioral patterns he demonstrated in the past. There was a moment during the interview, quiet but telling, when Zachary admitted he hadn't intended to confess at all, that if it hadn't been for his wife and child, for that final moment of human contact, he might have stayed silent forever. He admitted that he thought about ending his life, that he had left one bullet in the chamber, not for defense, but for escape. That admission reframed everything. It wasn't just the killings. It was the knowledge of what he'd done, the certainty that he would never walk free again, and the grim resolve to make that choice final, until something in him, something small and nearly forgotten, hesitated. The detectives let him speak. They didn't push. There was no need. Zachary had already decided how this would end, long before the first question was asked. And in that room, with only fluorescent light and silence for company, the story of Grass Lake's quiet execution finally took shape. Not as a spontaneous act of panic, but as the last step in a long and deliberate descent. As the interrogation drew to a close and the cameras continued their quiet, blinking surveillance, Zachary Borton remained seated. He didn't ask for water. He didn't demand a lawyer. What lingered in the air was not tension, but something heavier, resignation. He spoke now with a strange calm, his voice leveled not by peace, but by finality. When questioned about his criminal past, he didn't deny the charges. In fact, he offered more than what was in the files. He acknowledged the restraining orders, the failed custody hearings, the episodes of violence with his ex-wife. He described the night he tried to force his way into her home, the shattered window, the gunshot fired at a security camera. Not out of rage, he claimed, but to eliminate evidence. It wasn't personal. It was calculated. Like everything else, he admitted to following her, watching her, waiting for moments to confront her when she was alone. One such moment ended in him ramming her car with his own, trying to take his son. That detail, the use of force to regain control, wasn't just a pattern. It was his blueprint. Zachary didn't respond to loss with grief or reflection. He responded with strategy, with tactics meant to overpower, to dominate, to reclaim a narrative that always seemed to slip from his grip. The detectives began to see a larger picture, one not confined to the events of a single night in Grass Lake. Zachary's life was a continuous rehearsal of violence, each act more refined than the last. There were no emotional outbursts, no confessions wrapped in guilt, only admissions layered with justification, as though each violent act was, in his mind, an answer to something the world had done to him first. One of the detectives asked about a woman named Cassie, a name that surfaced during the background checks, a woman who had disappeared years ago after reportedly dating Zachary. The case had never been solved, her body never found. Zachary didn't flinch. He didn't deny knowing her. He simply said she left, that people like him don't get to hold on to anyone for very long. Whether that was an admission or deflection was unclear, but his voice lowered when he said it, and he never spoke her name again. From a behavioral standpoint, Zachary displayed traits common in high-functioning sociopaths. His affect remained flat. His recollection of events was precise, but emotionally distant. When he did mention his son, it was never in the context of love, but as part of his motivation, an extension of himself rather than a separate life he had damaged. Even the moment he met his family before the confession, The tearful goodbye seemed more like the closing of a chapter than the weight of remorse. He was asked if he felt sorry. For Michael, for Delmare, for anyone. There was a long pause before he answered. Then he said something simple, that it didn't matter anymore, that people would believe what they wanted, and that in the end the result would be the same. Life without parole. A cell. A number. A door that opens only when someone else decides it's time to move. The interview ended, not with a bang, but with silence. Zachary was led from the room without resistance. Outside, the corridor echoed with each footstep, until even those faded away. Back in the room, the detectives sat for a moment longer, their notes untouched. They had the confession, they had the evidence, but what they were left with was something harder to define. The weight of having witnessed a man not unravel, but accept who he had always been. Not a moment of transformation, but confirmation. And still, there were things left unsaid. Moments between the lines. People whose names never made it into the file. Warnings that had gone ignored. Doors that had closed too late. When Zachary Borton walked into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted, not with noise, but with something quieter. A tension that wrapped itself around every person seated inside. There were no cameras, no outbursts, just the steady echo of his footsteps on the polished floor and the low murmur of breath being held. He wore the standard jail-issued uniform. No visible emotion crossed his face. If he felt fear, or regret, or shame, it didn't show. He looked ahead, as if the room were already behind him. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The evidence spoke for itself. 2 dead men. A weapon traced directly to Zachary. A full confession recorded without coercion. The trajectory of the bullets. The absence of defensive wounds. The clean, clinical nature of both killings. All of it painted a picture that no amount of denial could rewrite. Even so, the court allowed Zachary his right to speak. He declined. No final statement, no plea for leniency. The judge read the sentence with a tone that didn't rise or fall. It was not personal. It was not emotional. It was definitive. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Zachary Borton would die in prison. That was no longer a question, only a matter of when. What stood out most wasn't the sentence, but the silence that followed it. The courtroom, filled with people who had waited months for this moment, sat in stillness. The families of the victims didn't cheer, didn't weep. They stared at the man who had taken their loved ones with such ease, and saw nothing that resembled remorse looking back at them. Zachary didn't glance toward them. He didn't acknowledge the names read aloud. To him, the past had already been buried, not with the victims, but inside himself. There was no admission of guilt, because in his mind, guilt had no meaning anymore. Only consequence did. And now, that consequence was absolute. Outside, the press stood behind barriers, waiting for statements that never came. The case had drawn attention, but not spectacle. It wasn't a crime of passion or a killing spree filled with chaos and clues. It was something colder, simpler, the kind of violence that leaves no room for doubt, only for mourning. At the prison intake facility, Zachary was processed like every other inmate. Fingerprints, photos, paperwork. He said little. When asked about any medical needs, he shook his head. When asked if he feared for his safety, he responded with indifference. In a place where many cling to identity or reputation to survive, Zachary seemed to want nothing. No alliances, no leverage. He didn't act like a man who expected to endure, only one who had accepted erasure. And yet, Even in that erasure, he left behind questions. Questions about what could have prevented it, about how many times warning signs had gone unnoticed, or unreported, or simply ignored. His path to that house in Grass Lake hadn't begun with blood. It had begun long before, in hallways where no one listened, in homes where silence grew louder than screams. The system had known him, known his name, known what he was capable of. But knowing had not been enough. Action had come too late.